It is 2:17 a.m. Somewhere in the northern Arabian Sea, approximately 340 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz, the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln is dark. Not operationally dark, there is no such thing on an active carrier strike group, but dark in the way that warships go dark when the math of the situation has already been calculated and no one wants to say the number out loud. The air smells of jet fuel and salt and something harder to name. The kind of tension that settles into your chest like ballast. The kind that does not go anywhere until the shooting stops. Operation Epic Fury had entered its 13th day. The joint U.S.-Israeli campaign had systematically worked through Iran's air defense architecture, its ballistic missile production infrastructure, and its naval shore facilities with a precision that intelligence analysts would later describe as the most operationally efficient sustained air campaign since the 1991 Gulf War. Natanz had been struck. Fordow had been penetrated. The regime's command nodes in Tehran had been reduced to rubble and secondary command posts. But 13 days of escalation had taught one immutable lesson about the adversary. They were not finished. They were never finished until they chose to be. The Combat Information Center of the Abraham Lincoln is a cathedral of blue light and controlled urgency. 41 personnel are on watch. The air is recycled through filters that cannot quite kill the metallic smell of overworked electronics. Every screen in the CIC is populated with data. Track numbers, bearing rates, intercept geometry, time to impact vectors. The tactical action officer has not left her post in 9 hours. Her eyes move the way experienced operators' eyes move, not scanning, but sampling, pulling specific pixels of information out of the noise with a discipline that looks like stillness, but is actually controlled violence directed inward. At 2:19 a.m., the first warning arrives not through the CIC speakers, but through a change in the sound of the room. A subtle drop in background conversation. A tightening. The SPY-1D radar mounted above the island superstructure has been painting an anomalous return to the northwest for 11 minutes, a return that could have been attributed to sea clutter, to atmospheric ducting, to electronic ghost. But at 2:19 a.m., the return resolves. It splits. Where there was one ambiguous contact, there are now 14 distinct tracks climbing out of the Iranian coastline at trajectories that leave no room for interpretation. Ballistic missiles. 14 of them. The tactical action officer designates the contact package, Threat Track Sierra, November at 2:19:43 a.m. The Abraham Lincoln is not alone. The carrier strike group extends across 50 nautical miles of dark water. To the northeast, the guided missile cruiser picks up the same tracks through its SPY-1B radar. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers screen to the northwest, the threat direction. A third destroyer holds south. A Virginia-class submarine runs silent 200 meters below, contributing data through the integrated undersea picture while holding its own weapons in reserve. This is a layered architecture designed for exactly this. The men and women inside it know that being designed for something and actually surviving it are two different conversations. At 2:21 a.m., a second contact layer emerges from the southeastern quadrant of the Iranian coast. This one moves differently. Lower, slower, spread across a wider bearing, not a tight missile salvo but a loose, staggered formation of tracks, moving at subsonic speeds below 500 feet altitude. Shahed derivative platforms, long-range attack drones, modified since the June 2025 campaign, with guidance packages that intelligence had assessed as incorporating GPS-resistant terminal seekers. 47 tracks. Then 51. Then 58, as the radar picture fills in and the full geometry of the attack becomes visible. The watch officer steps to the display. He does not say anything for 3 seconds. The silence in that moment is its own kind of communication. 58 drones plus 14 ballistic missiles arriving from 2 separate vectors, timed to converge within a window of less than 90 seconds. Someone in Tehran had spent serious time on this problem. This was not a revenge salvo fired in grief and rage. This was a calculated, coordinated saturation attempt designed by people who had studied the intercept geometry of an American carrier strike group and had done the arithmetic on its magazine depth. The tactical action officer initiates weapons free at 2:21:38 a.m. The decision does not require permission. The rules of engagement had been updated 6 days earlier when Iranian anti-ship ballistic missiles had struck a pier facility in Bahrain. Every U.S. ship in theater was operating under authority to engage inbound threats without further authorization. The order flows from the TAO to the weapons consoles in a voice that is level and precise and contains no excess syllables. There is no drama in her delivery. There is only the transfer of calculated intention into the fire control system. The first SM-3 Block IIA exits a forward VLS on the lead destroyer at 2:22:04 a.m. The deck plates of the destroyer vibrate with the ignition sequence, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a low-frequency resonance that moves through the soles of boots and up through joints and into the teeth of the crew. The missile breaks the surface of the sea and begins its endo-atmospheric climb, the exhaust plume catching no light because there is no light to catch, invisible except to the thermal cameras tracking it upward. The second SM-3 follows 11 seconds later. Then the cruiser fires. Then the second destroyer. The fire control solutions have been pre-computed and distributed across the force through the Cooperative Engagement Capability Network. Each platform shooting at deconflicted targets, no wasted rounds, the geometry optimized with a precision that would be beautiful in any other context. At 2:24 a.m., the first intercepts begin registering in the high atmosphere above the northwestern Arabian Sea. The kill vehicles find their targets at altitudes where the air is thin enough that the explosions generate no sound wave, only light, brief silent detonations that appear on the thermal cameras as white blooms against the dark of space and then extinguish. The SPY-1D tracks the debris. 3 missiles have been intercepted. 4. 6. The TAO is counting. 9. 12. The engagement geometry is playing out correctly, but the math is relentless. 14 inbound ballistics, 12 intercepted in the mid-course phase. 2 have survived the upper engagement layer. 2 are in terminal descent, their re-entry vehicles steering toward the carrier strike group with the cold indifference of physics. The cruiser transitions to SM-2 terminal engagement solutions at 2:26:17 a.m. Its fire control radar reaches out and locks the 2 surviving re-entry vehicles with a precision that requires the system to track objects moving at speeds that exceed a rifle round by an order of magnitude. The first SM-2 intercepts. The second SM-2 intercepts. But the terminal phase of a ballistic missile intercept produces fragmentation, and fragmentation does not simply disappear. At 2:26:41 a.m., the lead destroyer reports fragments impacting the water 800 meters off its port bow. The hits are non-damaging. The hits are, by any tactical measure, a success. But the crew of the destroyer has just watched pieces of a ballistic warhead enter the water close enough to spray their flight deck with salt, and something that the watchstander on the bridge will later describe in his log as incandescent debris. And in the CIC of the Abraham Lincoln, the TAO notes the fragmentation pattern and adjusts the standoff geometry for the next engagement. The first lesson of this night has been purchased. The second lesson arrives at 2:28 a.m. The drone swarm is now 140 nautical miles out, and the radar picture shows a formation that has been designed to overwhelm point defense logic. The 58 tracks have reorganized into 3 distinct attack echelons, each staggered by approximately 4 minutes of flight time. The spacing is deliberate. The intent is to force the strike group to engage the first echelon, deplete ESSM stocks on the second echelon, and arrive at the phalanx CIWS close-in engagement with a third echelon that can overwhelm guns with numbers. Whoever designed this attack understood that American ships are not resource unlimited. They understood that every SM-6 fired is a cell that cannot be immediately reloaded in the middle of the ocean. They had calculated the magazine depth of a carrier strike group and designed an attack intended to reach the bottom of it. The 2 MH-60R Seahawk helicopters airborne since 2 a.m. are repositioned northwest. Their laser designators are active. The crews have been flying for nearly 3 hours on a night where the sea state is a 4 and the horizon is indistinguishable from the sky. The lead pilot holds at 800 feet and paints the lead drone in the first echelon with the targeting laser. The data feed transmits to the CIC in real time. The aircrewman watches the drone on the forward infrared camera and reports that it moves with the particular patience that makes it dangerous. Patient things do not flinch. At 2:29 a.m., the destroyers begin engaging the first drone echelon with SM-6 missiles, using the Seahawk's targeting data to improve track quality at range. The SM-6 is expensive precision for this target class, but at night, against GPS-hardened navigation and reduced radar cross-sections, it is what the math requires. 4. Destroyed. 7. 11. The fire control systems are operating at thermal limits. The SPY-1D radar on the lead destroyer has a temperature gauge the petty officer has been watching for 40 minutes, climbing toward a threshold that, if crossed, requires a recovery cycle. A coverage gap during active engagement would be real. The adversary's drones would fill it. The technician watching the gauge does not report it yet. He is a petty officer second class with 6 years in the Navy, and he has calculated that reporting it now adds one more variable to a TAO, who is already managing 40 tracks. He watches the gauge. He keeps his face neutral. This is what discipline actually looks like. Not the firing sequence, but one junior sailor holding critical information in exactly the right container for exactly the right duration. At 2:31 a.m., the second drone echelon crosses 90 nautical miles. The first echelon has been reduced to 6 surviving tracks, 6 drones that have absorbed the full weight of the SM-6 engagement without being destroyed, either through luck of geometry or through terminal maneuvering that has degraded the intercept quality. These 6 are now 28 nautical miles out. The ESSM launchers aboard the cruiser and the nearest destroyer fire. The ESSM is faster and cheaper and built for this engagement band. 3 drones destroyed. 4. The 5th takes 2 rounds before its track disappears from the screen. The sixth performs a maneuver at 2:32:14 a.m. that the TAO will later describe as non-nominal terminal behavior, a sharp jinking descent that causes the fire control solution to fall out of parameters for 1.4 seconds. In 1.4 seconds, at the speeds involved, the geometry changes enough that the 3rd ESSM passes behind the target. The 4th ESSM finds it. The drone disintegrates at 4.2 nautical miles from the lead destroyer. Fragments rain into the ocean. The watchstander on the destroyer's bridge does not exhale. He has learned from the ballistic engagement that exhaling is premature. He is correct. At 2:33 a.m., a diesel submarine, Iranian Kilo class, assessed as pierside at Bandar Abbas based on 48 hours of prior intelligence, is making turns at 7 knots on a bearing pointing toward the carrier. The intelligence was wrong. The submarine left port under acoustic silence, using a thermal layer to mask its transit, positioning inside the strike group's ASW zone, while the surface engagement consumed every sensor and every operator above the waterline. This is the desperation move. This is the play designed by the same mind that designed the ballistic drone saturation attack, not as the primary weapon, but as the residual option, the card played when the missile and drone salvos have consumed the defensive attention of the strike group and the carrier's ASW screen has contracted inward to deal with the surface threat. The submarine is carrying torpedoes. The firing solution on a 100,000-ton carrier, moving at 15 knots in a straight line evasion posture, is not complicated. At 2:33 a.m., the geometry is favorable for the submarine. The Virginia-class attack submarine does not wait for orders. Its commanding officer has been tracking this contact for 11 minutes, building a firing solution while the surface battle consumed every layer above him. Classification confidence arrives at 2:33 a.m. The CO authorizes a Mk-48 torpedo engagement at 2:33:27 a.m. The torpedo exits the tube and runs silent through water that is dark and cold and indifferent to the stakes of what is happening inside it. In the CIC of the Abraham Lincoln, the submarine contact report arrives on the display at 2:34 a.m., 1 minute after the Virginia has already fired. The tactical action officer sees the contact, begins reformulating the defensive picture, then sees the torpedo track from her own submarine, already on intercept geometry. 2 seconds of recognition that the layered architecture held even when tested at the seam. Then, back to the second drone echelon, 55 nautical miles out and closing, because there is no pause in this night. The Iranian Kilo-class submarine is disabled at 2:36 and 8 seconds a.m. The Mk-48's detonation is felt as a low, prolonged vibration through the hull of the Abraham Lincoln, a sensation that the off-watch personnel sleeping in their racks will later describe as something between an earthquake and a truck accident, distant and wrong in a way that is hard to localize. The submarine does not sink immediately. The damage assessment will come later. What matters at 2:36 a.m. is that the torpedo solution is no longer a factor in the Abraham Lincoln's survival calculus. The second drone echelon has become the only surviving threat, and it is 44 nautical miles out. The Phalanx CIWS aboard the carrier and its escort destroyers have been in thermal tracking mode since 2:20 a.m., their radar eyes open, their 20mm gun barrels elevated, their fire control computers running intercept solutions against every track in the tactical picture. The Phalanx does not require human authorization. It is a closed-loop system that will fire when a track enters its engagement envelope and meets the parameters of a hostile designation. At this point in the night, every drone in the picture carries a hostile designation. The CIWS systems are, by this point in the engagement, the last layer. The TAO knows this. She also knows that the second echelon has 23 surviving drones, and the third echelon, still 80 miles out, has 17 more. She conducts a rapid magazine state assessment across the force. The destroyers have depleted their SM-6 capacity by 34%. The cruiser has expended 60% of its ESSM inventory. The VLS architecture of the strike group was deep enough to absorb this, but the depth is visibly shallower than it was at midnight. This is what the adversary calculated. Not destruction. Depletion. Every round fired tonight is a round that is not available for the next night, and the next night, and the night after that. The cost of survival is measured in cells. At 2:40 a.m., the second echelon engages with remaining ESSM and SM-2 rounds, supplemented by the Seahawk crews who have now been airborne for close to 4 hours, and whose performance is degrading at the margins in ways that neither of them will acknowledge out loud. The lead pilot's hands are steady. His scan is steady. But the thermal camera is showing him drones at distances and aspect angles that require a level of instrument precision that grows more expensive to maintain with every additional minute of flight time. He holds it. He holds the laser. He paints targets for the ship's fire control system with a fidelity that is the product of training and physical will in equal measure. 18 of the 23 second echelon drones are destroyed at range. 5 survive into the inner defense zone. The CIWS systems on the lead destroyer engage at 2:42:31 a.m. The 20mm rounds find 3. A fourth is struck but survives the initial burst and impacts the water 600 meters off the destroyer's starboard bow in a detonation that sends a water column 40 feet into the air and rattles the destroyer's superstructure with the force of a near miss. The fifth drone is tracked, engaged, struck, and its wreckage impacts the destroyer's forward gun mount. Not the warhead. The airframe. The motor and the guidance package and the fuel residue arrive at 180 miles per hour and strike the 5-inch gun mount with a force that bends the barrel housing and knocks the gun offline for the remainder of the engagement. No personnel are injured. The gun mount will not fire tonight. In the CIC, the damage report arrives at 2:43 a.m. The TAO acknowledges it with a single key entry in the log and redirects attention to the third echelon, which is now 52 nautical miles out. The third echelon is smaller, 17 drones, and the strike group has enough remaining ordnance to address it, though not with the comfortable margins of the first engagement. The math is tight. It is the kind of tight that the people who designed American air defense systems intended to never encounter in practice, and encounter frequently in exercises, and encounter tonight in the real arithmetic of a 13-day war that is not over. At 2:51 a.m., the third echelon is engaged. The fire control solutions are efficient. The targets are not adapting. Whoever commanded the Iranian attack force had placed its primary bet on the saturation sequence working, and when that sequence failed to penetrate the carrier's defensive envelope, the third echelon received no modification order. 12 destroyed at range. 3 destroyed inside 15 miles. 2 survived to CYWS range. Both are engaged and destroyed at 2:53:41 a.m. The last track in the tactical picture disappears from the display. The CIC is quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Not the quiet of relief. The quiet of people who have been operating at maximum cognitive load for 37 minutes and whose nervous systems require exactly 4 seconds to begin the process of recalibrating towards something that is not immediate survival. The tactical action officer conducts a force-wide communications check. Every ship responds. Every ship is maneuvering. The cruiser has a minor radar component overheating. The SPY-1B has been running above design parameters for 11 consecutive minutes and requires a 40-second thermal recovery cycle that its crew initiates immediately. The lead destroyer has its forward gun mount offline and is assessing structural integrity of the mount housing. The Abraham Lincoln itself is undamaged. The flight deck teams begin preparing for the first recovery cycle of the post-engagement period, bringing F/A-18S back aboard that have been holding at altitude through the entire engagement, their pilots receiving data feeds through their helmet systems and watching the defense play out below them in the language of radar tracks and fire control geometries. At 3:01 a.m., the watch officer compiles the preliminary engagement report. The official version will take weeks and produce doctrine improvements that save future lives. The preliminary report captures what happened in the immediate human-scale language of the watch. 14 ballistic missiles. All 14 intercepted or defeated. 58 drones in 3 echelons. 54 destroyed before reaching the inner defense zone. 3 inner zone intercepts via CIWS. 1 airframe impact on the lead destroyer's gun mount, non-fatal, equipment damage, gun offline. 1 Iranian Kilo-class submarine disabled by Mk-48 torpedo engagement from Virginia-class asset. 0 aircraft lost. 0 personnel fatalities. And then the numbers that do not appear in the engagement report, but that the TAO has been running in her head since 2:42 a.m. SM-3 expenditure, 8 rounds. SM-6 expenditure, 14 rounds. SM-2 expenditure, 9 rounds. ESSM expenditure, 22 rounds. Total VLS cells expended, 53. In a strike group sized for sustained operations, 53 expended cells represent a depletion that must be addressed within 72 hours if the force is to maintain its assigned operational tempo. The logistics ships are positioned. The resupply geometry has already been calculated, but the resupply run will require a 12-hour window at reduced operational speed, and in a 13-day war where the adversary has demonstrated coordinated multi-domain saturation attacks, that window is a constraint the operations staff will minimize but cannot eliminate. The lead pilot lands his Seahawk at 3:08 a.m., 5 hours and 11 minutes airborne. His aircrewman climbs out onto the deck and pauses, one hand on the fuselage, for a second, in the dark. Not ritual. Not something he could explain under questioning. Just a hand on metal, in the salt air, on a flight deck that smells of exhaust and the particular exhaustion that belongs to people who have been asked to hold something together and have held it. At 3:14 a.m., the Petty Officer Second Class files his temperature log on the SPY-1D cooling system. The gauge peaked at 94% of thermal threshold during the engagement. It never crossed the line. The system never cycled down. The coverage gap never materialized. The log entry is 3 lines. It is accurate. It is complete. The northern Arabian Sea at 3:20 a.m. is dark and moving. The waves have no politics. The salt spray has no allegiance. The wind moves across the flight deck and pulls at the tie-down chains of aircraft in a way that sounds, if you close your eyes, like something patient and permanent. 4 enemy platforms, 14 ballistic missiles, 58 drones, 1 submarine, 37 minutes of continuous multi-domain engagement, 53 cells expended, 0 crew fatalities, 0 inches yielded. The line between the free passage of international waters and the ambitions of a regime determined to close them was drawn tonight not in the language of speeches or treaties or diplomatic cables, but in the language of fire control solutions and radar tracks and a junior sailor watching a temperature gauge in a compartment that history will never name. That line holds because the people standing on it have decided, with a clarity that requires no ceremony, that it does not move. The ocean does not remember the missiles. It remembers the ships that stood in their path and did not yield.